This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The state of Texas is facing growing calls to halt the execution of Rodney Reed, an African-American man who spent over 20 years in prison for a rape and murder he says he did not commit. A group of 26 Texas lawmakers, including both Democrats and Republicans, penned a letter this week asking Governor Greg Abbott to stop the execution planned for November 20th. More than 1.4 million people have signed an online petition to save Reed's life. Supporters include celebrities Kim Kardashian West, Rihanna, and Meek Mill. Rodney Reed was sentenced to die after being convicted by an all-white jury for the 1996 murder of Stacey Stites, a 19-year-old white woman. The two were having an affair at the time. But substantial evidence has since emerged implicating Stites' fiancé, a white police officer named Jimmy Fenella, who was later jailed on kidnapping and rape charges in another case. In a major development, a man who spent time in jail with Fenella signed an affidavit last month asserting that Fenella had admitted in prison he killed his fiancée because she was having an affair with a black man. Later in the show, we'll be joined by Rodney Reed's brother and sister-in-law. But first, let's turn to the documentary, A Plea for Justice, made by Filmmakers for Justice.
Bastrop County Sheriff says they found the body of a woman along the dirt road of 1441. Now, let me tell you, this morning, 19-year-old Stacey Lee Stites was reported missing and never arrived at work.
In 2006, a small documentary film team helped expose how an innocent man ended up on Texas's death row.
But my personal opinion when I heard that she had been killed was that Fenella had done it immediately. And I know a number of people around here that felt the same way.
It soon became apparent that the case against Rodney Reed was not just a small-town affair.
And I believe the state knew about it. I believe the district attorney for Bastrop knew about it. I believe the Sheriff's Department knew about it, and I believe the Bastrop Police Department knew about it. And I do believe they covered that up. They did not want a fellow officer implicated.
In the past 13 years, the evidence has continued to mount in favor of Rodney Reed's innocence.
A Georgetown police sergeant is spending the night behind bars. Jimmy Fenella Jr. is accused of sexually assaulting a woman he detained.
His guilty pleas today could play a major role in the appeal process of convicted murderer Rodney Reed.
Key witnesses have recanted crucial testimony.
Did Roberto Bayardo make missteps that hindered justice in some of the most high-profile crimes? A man within days of execution now awaiting word of an appeal after Bayardo clarified his conclusions on when that woman died.
Key law enforcement officials who oversaw the initial investigation have been charged and convicted for their own misconduct.
The man who oversaw the Reed investigation, Bastrop Sheriff Richard Hernandez, who also turned out to be a dirty cop and pled guilty to 6 felonies.
And critical scientific medical evidence has been discovered that essentially exonerates Rodney Reed.
She had been face down for 5 or more hours in one position before she was turned over to the new position. She was dead around midnight. She was already dead.
Yet instead of exonerating Reed or even retrying him under fair conditions, the Texas courts have decided to set a November 20th execution date for this year.
An excerpt from A Plea for Justice about the Rodney Reed case. Last month, the popular daytime TV host Dr. Phil aired an interview he did with Rodney Reed on death row.
If you have a message to say, what is it?
I am absolutely innocent of this case. I absolutely had nothing to do with Stacey's death. I want to be a father to my kids. I want to be a grandfather to my grandchildren. I want to be able to be the son to look after my mother and the brother to my brothers. I want to be a part of my family and my friend's life.
And to be very clear, did you rape and murder Stacey Stites?
No, I absolutely did not. No.
You had nothing to do with it at all?
Nothing to do with Stacey's death. I wasn't with her that night. I had absolutely nothing to do with her death.
And you said that they didn't want to bring in, if there's DNA evidence in these allegations against you for other sexual assaults that they're throwing up against the wall, you're saying Let's bring all that forward. Bring that, if there's that DNA evidence, we have technology now that they didn't have then. You're saying let's bring that out now. Let's find out if that's right.
Let's test it. Don't fault me for anything that you have done.
Rodney Reed speaking on the Dr. Phil show ahead of his execution scheduled for November 20th. Well, I recently sat down with Rodney Reed's brother and sister-in-law, who we'll hear from later in the show. They recently came to our studio along with Bryce Benjet, a senior attorney at the Innocence Project. I began by asking Bryce Benjet to lay out the story.
Stacey Stites was found murdered on the afternoon of April 23rd, and her fiancé, Jimmy Fenella, claimed that she was murdered while on her way to work that morning.
Like at 3 in the morning?
Yeah, roughly 3 o'clock in the morning. And the state theorized that Rodney Reed had somehow abducted her while she was on her way to work, kidnapped her, took her out to a remote location, sexually assaulted her, and murdered her. And the state's case really rested on 2 pillars. One was forensic science. They had 3 experts who claimed that the presence of a small amount of Rodney's semen was evidence that he had sexually assaulted Miss Stites at around the time that she was murdered. And they relied on Jimmy Fenella to establish this timeline and to establish that they were a happy couple in which Miss Stites would not be having an affair with Mr. Reed. Meanwhile, at the trial, Mr. Reed presented some evidence to witnesses who said that they did know about this affair. In fact, his unprepared lawyers had access to other witnesses, but they went uninvestigated and not presented. And so over the 2 decades that we've been working on this case, every aspect of the state's proof has essentially evaporated. The forensic experts who the state relied on have all recanted their testimony.
Explain.
So the forensic pathologist, Roberto Bayardo, who did the autopsy, he established the time frame of this 3 o'clock murder, and he said that the semen was fresh, therefore had to be related to the murder. That was backed up by a forensic serologist from the DNA lab, as well as a DPS, Texas DPS crime scene technician. None of
DPS
that was true,
means?
Texas Department of Public Safety. And so none of this theory was true. They told the jury that these small amount of sperm could not have been there for more than 24 hours after they were found. In fact, that number is 72. And when we went back and talked to Roberto Bayardo, who was the key witness for the state about this theory, he retracted his entire testimony. He said that the state should not have relied on his estimation of the time of death and should not have relied on his statements about the semen. And in fact, he said that the evidence suggested that there was consensual sex between Rodney and Stacey the day before, which is exactly what Rodney has said all along to his lawyers at a bond hearing where Rodney's mother testified about the relationship, and at the trial. And so we really have a situation where every aspect of the state's proof has been negated, but that's not all. The state, for months, investigated Jimmy Fenella as this prime suspect in the murder, and this was even before—
This is Stacey's fiancé.
Yes.
And cop. He's a cop.
So local law enforcement officer Jimmy Fenella, who's engaged to Stacey Stites, was the prime suspect for months. They knew it was not Fenella's semen in the body, but they still believed that he was a suspect. He was actively interrogated, and after he failed a second polygraph test on facts about the murder, he invoked his right to silence and refused to cooperate. That investigation, however, stopped after Mr. Reed's semen was identified. And suddenly, Jimmy Fenella was no longer their suspect, and Rodney Reed. Jimmy Fenella was no longer their suspect, and Rodney Reed was prosecuted and then ultimately sentenced to death.
And so the alternative theory of what happened with the rookie cop, Jimmy Fenella, the fiancé of Stacey Stites, was what happened that night.
Well, and so every piece of evidence that we've found over the course of 20 years now points to Jimmy Fenella. It points to the fact that the law enforcement officers investigating this case who suspected Fenella were right. When you look at Fenella's background, he had a history of excessive force even prior to the murder. His girlfriend, right after the murder, described him as emotionally abusive, virulently racist, and
he's white and Rodney Reed is black.
Yes. And so the idea of an interracial relationship would not be something he would like.
And didn't someone quote Stacey as saying that he told her he would kill her if she was ever unfaithful?
Yes. In fact, that's something we've heard from several witnesses now. And as we've looked into this case, we've always suspected things about Jimmy Fenella from the beginning. I took this case in 2002. And lo and behold, several years later, I pick up the newspaper and we find out that Jimmy Fenella had been arrested. And ultimately, he was prosecuted and pled guilty to crimes related to kidnapping and raping a woman while he was on patrol. And when the Texas Department of Public Safety investigated Jimmy Fenella, they found that this was not a one-off incident, that there was a pattern going back years. And so here we have the defense, which was woefully unprepared, did not have the time to present a case, and now we know everything about that defense. Everything that Rodney Reed was saying has, in fact, been shown to be true.
Bryce Benjett, senior attorney at the Innocence Project, his client Rodney Reed is scheduled to be executed by the state of Texas November 20th for a murder and rape he says he did not commit. Growing evidence shows Reed was framed as part of a cover-up to protect a white police officer, Jimmy Fenella, who killed his own fiancée, Stacey Stites. More than 1.4 million people have signed an online petition to save Reed's life. I recently sat down with two members of Rodney Reed's family, his brother Rodney Reed and his sister-in-law, Wana Akpan, as well as Rodney Reed's attorney, Bryce Benjett of the Innocence Project. I asked Rodney Reed how it felt to have his brother face the death penalty all these years.
Well, it's been real hard, It's like they got a piece of us down there on death row as well, It's stressful. It's, I don't know if words can describe it when you know your brother is innocent of something and then you have to leave him in a place where they're trying to kill him, you know what I mean? That's a stressful thing. And I try to do all that I can do to keep a positive mind about the situation, try to keep him positive and everything. And God is so amazing because when I go down there to try to lift him up, he's lifting us up. He's making us smile. He's encouraging us, you know what I mean? And it's been tough. It's been 22 and a half years since we've been able to touch him, since my mom has been able to just hold his hand.
No contact
No
visit.
contact. No contact at all. We haven't, no. And, the hardest thing for me in these 22 and a half years, each and every time, is when from the first time I went to visit him to the last time I've seen him is when I touch that glass and give him that pound, leaving him behind. I can't take him with me as bad as I want to because I know he's innocent, but I have to leave him there, and that I haven't got over that yet, and it's been 22 and a half years. That's real hard.
How is your mother coping with this?
My mother, she's a strong lady. She's coping. She's, I've seen this ager. I've seen it, the age. She's aging, but at the same time, she's very strong, she's positive, and she holds on to her faith, and right now she's very optimistic. She and I and the rest of the family believe Rodney's coming home.
One of the things that are astounding is that it's not as if all the evidence has been destroyed, so how do you go back and recreate the situation? There is evidence waiting to be DNA tested in police custody.
Yes.
So why hasn't it been tested?
I believe it hasn't been tested because they know what the test results will come out to. It will point at Jimmy Fenella, David Hall, Ed Fenella, those guys' DNA are all over the scene. All of them are cops. And I believe that's the reason they haven't tested it. Honestly, that's just my opinion.
And what is the evidence that you want DNA tested? And in whose custody is it?
We have asked for DNA testing for years now from the Bastrop County District Attorney, which certainly has the power to release the evidence. We've offered to pay for that testing.
What is the evidence?
And so Stacey Stites was murdered. She was strangled with a belt. That belt was then separated into two pieces by the murderer, one left by the body, one left by the vehicle in which she was traveling, or alleged to have been traveling. And so obviously the murderer handled both pieces of that belt. That, at the time, was not the type of evidence that you could test and get DNA from the murderer because it was very early DNA technology. Today, we can test that belt. We can test areas of the clothing where she was dragged and find evidence of the murderer. And unfortunately, even though we've offered to pay for the testing, the state has refused. We've gone to court about this, and the Texas Court of Criminal Appeals has interpreted the DNA law in Texas to prohibit DNA testing of this type of evidence.
Why? On what grounds? On what grounds are they citing?
I can't really give a principled explanation for it, but essentially what they have said, the Court of Criminal Appeals has said, is we don't think that the legislature would want such an expansive right to DNA testing. And we've shown time and time again that that's just not true. Every time the Court of Criminal Appeals interprets the DNA law in a way that restricts access, we've gone to the legislature, and the legislature has expanded access. And so this is a situation where, I hate to say it, but the will of the people of Texas, that if we're going to have the death penalty, that we should make sure at least that the people that are subjected to that punishment are actually guilty.
I want to go back 7 years to June of 2012. A federal magistrate judge denied an appeal by Rodney Reed based on what he called unreliable claims of his consensual relationship with Stacey Stites. One reason the judge cited was that all of the witnesses affirming the relationship were friends of Rodney's and not Stacey Stites. In this clip from the documentary series A Plea for Justice, filmmakers interview Alicia Slater, a friend and former co-worker of Stacey, who confirms her relationship with Rodney Reed.
There was one instance where we were having lunch in the break room together, and it was just the two of us, and she pretty much was confiding in me. We were talking about her engagement ring, and I was like, oh, are you so excited to get married? And she said she really wasn't so excited to get married, and quickly followed that with saying that she was actually sleeping with a black guy named Rodney, and that she was, not sure what her fiance would do if he found out, and she had to be pretty careful about it. So she wasn't really excited about getting married because she was sleeping with a black dude named Rodney, she said.
According to Rodney Reed's first lawyer, Jimmy Brown, there were multiple co-workers at Stacey's grocery store job who knew and witnessed a relationship between she and Rodney Reed.
On everything that Rodney told me that happened, I was able to verify.
In a 2015 affidavit, Jimmy Brown states when he returned to the store a week later, those same witnesses were unwilling to speak with him under a presumed threat from the Bastrop police. Witness intimidation and threat were two of the main reasons Rodney Reed's lawyers had difficulty establishing the relationship during the original trial. However, since then, 20 different people have come forward, giving their personal knowledge that the relationship indeed existed.
So that's Alicia Slater, a friend and former co-worker of Stacey Stites, from the documentary A Plea for Justice. Bryce Benjet, talk about the significance of what she's saying and what court has heard what she had to say.
So this has been a problem all along. There was, as I said, some evidence of the relationship at trial, but it wasn't believed, I think in large part because the state presented this invalid forensic science, making that relationship impossible. That's been recanted, so that should change the way you look at these things. But over the years, Alicia Slater and more people have come out who have no affiliation with the family and frankly just have information. And so this is the key that the federal courts denied. And when we've presented this new evidence to the state courts, they've refused to consider it.
Who was the first lawyer?
Jimmy Brown was the first lawyer who was hired by the family. Unfortunately, the family didn't have the resources to continue to retain him, so the court actually appointed a series of lawyers who did not really prepare the case. And unfortunately, there was a rush to trial here, so that the lawyers who ultimately tried the case had almost no time to prepare, and they were investigating, they were doing forensic testing, even while the trial was going on.
And this is a death penalty case.
Yes. And so a death penalty case often requires over a year of preparation. In this case, there was less than 2 months before these lawyers were actually working on the case, and then they started picking the jury.
The allegation of witness tampering that came out in the documentary A Plea for Justice, what is that about?
So we heard from the first lawyer who was hired by the Reed family, went out, and they talked to a number of witnesses who believed that there was a relationship. He comes back soon thereafter, and nobody will talk to him. And we've heard from the trial attorneys that as soon as that they would drive into town, they would pick up a police tail. So this idea of witness intimidation is in the record. This is not some speculation here. This was not a fair trial. And with everything we know now, no jury would end up convicting Rodney Reed. And so what we need is just a fair trial where everybody hears truthful evidence. They hear valid science. They hear all the facts. And that's all that Rodney wants. And we think that that's what justice requires.
So let's now go to the renowned medical examiner, Michael Baden, speaking during an evidentiary hearing in October 2017. And again, tell us who Baden is, just the significance of his stature.
Sure. Michael Baden is essentially a legend of forensic pathology. He was involved in the reexamination of the murder of John F. Kennedy, of the Martin Luther King assassination, and is really the go-to forensic pathologist when the most important issues, in our country come up with regard to forensic pathology.
And when was he on the stand?
This was at an evidentiary hearing that was ordered based on suppressed exculpatory evidence that we discovered in 2017.
So this is a clip from the documentary A Plea for Justice with Dr. Michael Baden.
Usually the first question the police officer, the investigators want to know is, when did she die? Because that will influence the investigation of whom to interview and who's telling the truth and who isn't. This is something that all medical examiners and coroners learn immediately, is that there's certain changes in the body that indicate how long somebody's been dead. In my opinion, to a reasonable degree of medical certainty, she was dead before midnight of the day, the next day that she was found. She was dead around midnight. She was already dead.
So that's Dr. Michael Baden, and the significance of what he is saying and what you're calling for now.
So what he's saying is that Rodney Reed's guilt, the state's theory of how this crime occurred, is medically and scientifically impossible. And the time of death is actually when Jimmy Fenella said that he was alone with Stacey Stites in their apartment. And this was significant because at that hearing, we also heard from Jimmy Fenella's best friend at the time, who was a Bastrop sheriff's officer, who Jimmy Fenella actually gave a different story about where he was during this critical time period of when Stacey was murdered. He claimed that he had actually gone out late that night and was drinking, and that he came home late at night and that Stacey left in the morning without him. And so what we have here is a completely different forensic picture that shows the time of death is at a time that Jimmy Fenella told the jury he was at home with Stacey Stites, and now does not even have a consistent story about. When we asked Jimmy Fenella about this at the hearing, he refused to testify and asserted his Fifth Amendment privilege not to incriminate himself.
So Roderick Reed, your brother Rodney, that night, why the time matters so much, where was he at that time?
He was with my cousin, Chris Ulrich. They was in a, it was like a little community center right next door to the families. Everybody hung out there, and they was just sitting out there, just hanging out. That's where he was.
You're wearing a T-shirt that says "Face the Forensics," and it's a picture of Rodney. Hashtag Stop the Execution. Hashtag Test the DNA. Hashtag Free Rodney Reed now.
Yes.
And now is when we go to Wana Akpan. You're wearing a different T-shirt. It says, "Grant Rodney Reed a new trial." So I want to talk about that. And also, when you came into this picture, you're the sister-in-law of Rodney. Yes. You're married to Roderick. Talk about when you first learned about this case.
I first learned about the case when I was working as a survivor advocate at Safe Place. There's this annual MLK march that happens every year in Austin, and the ending parade ends at Houston-Tillotson University. And the first table that I saw was one, I think there was like flyers for Texas Coalition to Abolish the Death Penalty, and it had something related to Rodney's case. And I was talking with someone who was at the table. Basically, they invited me to come to an event about Rodney's case and everything. And when I got to the meeting, they talked about how there was DNA that hadn't been tested in his case. This was like right around his first execution date, the March 5th, 2015 one. And I thought it was crazy that they were trying to take this person's life and there was DNA that hadn't been tested that could prove that he didn't do the crime. And so, you know, that's when I got involved.
And that's also when you met Roderick?
Yes, soon after.
What's it been like for you to go to the death row prison to see Rodney?
It's hard because I know how, you know, Roderick and Rodney were really close. And, you know, Roderick talks about his relationship with Rodney all the time, how, you know, that was, to me, the relationship was like a best friend, deeper than a best friend. And seeing the pain of what this has done, and it's hard. When we go up there, seeing, it's like a feeling of extreme despair, you know, seeing how the tone changes when we leave Livingston, it's tough.
I want to go to Connie Lear now, victim of the Georgetown police officer Jimmy Fenella, Stacey Stites' fiance. Fenella was convicted and sentenced to 10 years in prison for raping Lear after he took her into police custody. This is a clip from A Plea for Justice of Lear being interviewed on the show Crime Watch Daily.
He just kept telling me to shut up. He asked me to dance for him, and I told him no. And when I told him no, he got mad. And he grabbed me and slammed me up against the back of his car where the trunk is. I kept telling him to stop, but he just told me to shut up, that I knew I liked it. And then if I told anybody, that he'd hunt me down when he got out of prison and kill me.
Fenella was convicted of raping her and went to jail for 10 years.
Yeah, he pled guilty to kidnapping and sex charges relating to that arrest. Again, the Texas law enforcement investigation of Jimmy Fenella arising out of that actually showed that that was a pattern of conduct. And so this was not an isolated incident. And so everything that the defense was saying to the jury, everything that we suspected when we first took this case, has proven to be true.
Where is he now? Because he just recently got out of prison.
We've been told by folks who've actually been out to the church and visited that he's a pastor at a church in Granger, Texas.
A pastor?
Yes.
And what did they say about his congregation, about his church?
They didn't talk about all of that, but basically that they went up there, and I think one person said that they delivered a free Rodney Reed bumper sticker to like one of the members of the congregation, and they were like, I don't want that.
Roderick, what are you calling for now?
We're calling for We're calling for justice. We're calling for Rodney to get a new trial, you know, because we were confident that when given this new trial, with all the evidence over all these years, all the testimonies and stuff from different witnesses and everything, that Rodney is coming home. We're confident of that. All we have to do is have the opportunity to present that. Because his life's on the line. I can't see them taking my brother's life for something he didn't do, and you did not give us that avenue to save his life. You are executing an innocent man, and at the end of the day, I don't see how anybody could sleep with that on their conscience, their mind, their heart.
What is your plea to the community right now, and how important is community response as this case goes through the courts? Your brother behind bars for more than 2 decades.
Our plea right now is for everybody to get involved, everybody to act, you know, to contact Governor Greg Abbott, Ken Paxton, the Board of Pardons and Paroles. Greg Abbott, has he made a statement on your brother's case? The governor of Texas? Not to my knowledge. Not to my knowledge. And just contact everybody, you know, use your social media, get this story out to help bring justice out of the streets and back into the courtroom where it belongs, you know, so we can get peace, not just for Rodney, but for Stacey Stites as well. Her family is going through this as well. And I feel sorry for her family that they have to go through this.
Do you know her family, and where do they stand on this?
I know members of her family. There's members of her family, they wrote a letter to the governor asking back in 2015 for clemency for my brother because they believe Rodney did not commit this crime. And they said they believe Jimmy Fenella has gotten away with murder in this letter to the governor. And they wrote the same letter to Bastrop County District Attorney Brian Gertz. They're stating this. One of the family members was on the Dr. Phil show with us as well, sitting right beside me. And I had dinner with her that night, later that night, and she was telling me about, you know, how the family feels. They're torn. Their family is torn, so they're going through pain. My family's going through pain, and yet a murderer is still out there on the street, and my brother is locked up, and we are dealing with this fight every day. We wake up with it on our mind, we go to bed with it on our mind, and this has been going on far too long. As far as other people that had been executed on Texas death row and later found out to be innocent, you know, that's hard for me to hear, because, see, you can't undo that. You can't undo that. And especially you're trying to take his life and you haven't tested the murder weapon? You haven't called all the witnesses? Who does that? Where do they do that at? Apparently in Bastrop County, that's where it's taking place, and we've got to do something about it.
That's Rodney Reed's brother, Rodney Reed, Rodney's sister-in-law, Juana Akpan, and his attorney, Bryce Benjet of the Innocence Project. Rodney Reed is scheduled to be executed by the state of Texas November 20th for the murder of Stacey Stites in 1996. In late October, Reed's legal team filed an application for clemency with the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles after a man revealed that Stacey Stites' fiancé, Jimmy Fenella, a white ex-police officer, had admitted to the murder while he was in prison for another crime. I want to end with the words of Rodney Reed speaking recently from death row to Dr. Phil.
Do you have anger about this? Do you have, I mean, you've been 22 and a half years in here for something you say you didn't do.
Something I didn't do.
Are you angry about that?
Initially, I was coming into prison, but then you have to let go of that anger. You can't live like that. I see it this way, that things that you have no control of, don't try to control the things you have no control of.
You said you miss the simple things in life. What are those simple things that you miss?
I mean, just being out and about, taking long walks, being able to see the moon, being able to try and count the stars.
How long has it been since you've seen the moon, since you've seen the sky?
Well, sometimes we got these little windows with these little slits where we can look out, and sometimes I'm looking out, you can't see them because of the angle that the building is. And you know they're there. I know they're there, though, but you just can't see.
That's Rodney Reed speaking to Dr. Phil on death row in Texas. Rodney Reed is scheduled to be executed by the state of Texas November 20th. When we come back, we look at election results from around the United States with John Nichols of The Nation. Stay with us.